shock is a condition that leaves the heart unable to pump enough blood to meet the metabolic demands of our tissues. Essentially, if the heart is not able to eject enough blood to send an adequate amount of oxygen out to our body, the tissues are not getting the oxygen reserves that they require, and that can lead to a whole slew of other issues. For example, you can see that metabolism for certain cells will be disrupted. If we're not bringing oxygen out to those body cells, those cells won't be able to metabolize glucose and make ATP. Remember, the process of turning glucose into ATP is called cellular respiration, also known as aerobic respiration, because 3 of the 4 chemical reactions that make it up do require oxygen. If we're not getting enough oxygen out to our tissues, we can also lead to necrosis and cell death. Without proper blood being delivered to our cell membrane may not have what it needs to properly facilitate transport from either side. So we tend to have problems with the cell membrane as well. There are several types of shock, namely hypovolemic shock, cardiogenic shock, vascular shock, and obstructive shock. We are going to primarily focus on hypovolemic shock, which refers to shock due to decreased blood volume. Hypo is low, volemic means volume, so this is low volume shock. In the event that we lose major volumes of blood, that would be hypovolemic shock. Now, taking the concepts that we've learned thus far, we can apply them and see how our body's going to react to such a condition. First and foremost, we need to do things that are going to increase volume back and also increase the blood pressure. In hypovolemic shock, as we drastically decrease the blood volume, we will therefore also reduce blood pressure, and that decreases cardiac output and deprives our body of oxygen. So one of the first things that our body's going to do to combat shock is start stimulating the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So many of our body systems will use this pathway to increase blood pressure. This is a very, very important pathway that we have seen. Hopefully you remember angiotensin II's 4 major actions, the first of which is vasoconstriction, and the second of which is the release of aldosterone. That will in turn help us to increase blood volume. 2 other actions of angiotensin II is to stimulate the release of antidiuretic hormone from our posterior pituitary. That's also going to help for vasoconstriction and the retention of water, and will also stimulate our thirst center. So angiotensin II will make you thirsty as well. That motivates you to go drink water, which can be absorbed and added to the blood volume. Through angiotensin II, we will be releasing antidiuretic hormone. This is also going to be a vasoconstrictor and go over to the kidneys and indicate that we need to start retaining water. Naturally, to increase blood pressure, we can't leave out the autonomic nervous system. We're definitely going to increase sympathetic stimulation and decrease parasympathetic stimulation. These will also help for vasoconstriction, increasing heart rate, and increasing the stroke volume. Now, all 3 of these actions seem to make pretty good sense so far, but it is this last box that seems a bit counterintuitive. You might be confused as to why we would be releasing local vasodilators. So far, we've been releasing a bunch of vasoconstrictors, so why is it that we're releasing local vasodilators instead of local vasoconstrictors? Well, the key word here is local. This is not a systemic vasodilator. It's a localized, very, very specific vasodilator. Those are going to be found in our individual organs, and they will vasodilate the vessels going through our organs to increase the blood flow getting to that organ. So that will actually stimulate more oxygen delivery to the tissues. These will be systemic vasoconstrictors, and that's going to increase our blood pressure. But we'll also have the vasodilation of localized areas, which will also be very helpful in increasing blood flow and oxygen delivery to those particular organs. Now this slide ties all of this together. This slide specifically will take information that we've learned in previous lecture videos and put it all in one place so that we can see how this entire mechanism is working together. This is all different negative feedback loops that we've seen previously, and we're now just putting them all together. So let's go ahead and look into what happens with hypovolemic shock. So naturally, if it's hypovolemic shock, we're going to decrease blood volume. And with a decrease in blood volume, we always get a decrease in blood pressure because there's less volume pushing against the walls of our vessels. The first thing that's going to happen is the baroreceptors, specifically in the arch of the aorta and the carotid sinus, are going to have their own little pathway that they'll take. These baroreceptors are sensing stretch on the walls of the vessels. Those are our pressure-sensitive mechanoreceptors, and they're naturally sending out inhibitory signals to the vasomotor center. The more they're stretched, the more frequently they send inhibitory signals, and the greater the inhibitory signals will be to the vasomotor center. So in the case of hypovolemic shock, we actually see the opposite of this. Because there is a decrease in blood volume and a decrease in blood pressure, those baroreceptors are not experiencing as much stretch as they normally would. Therefore, we're decreasing the rate of those inhibitory signals going out to the vasomotor center in the medulla oblongata and also up to the posterior pituitary. If our inhibitory signals are sent much slower, these two areas will pick up their activity. And we'll see that the vasomotor center is going to increase sympathetic stimulation by way of the sympathetic nervous system and also by affecting the adrenal medulla and causing the systemic release of catecholamines in the blood. These are directly going to have their effects on the heart and the blood vessels. These are going to increase heart rate and force of contraction and also increase vasoconstriction, both of which are stimuli that will eventually increase blood pressure. So the whole idea of this slide is returning blood volume and blood pressure back to normal, bringing blood pressure and blood volume back upwards. So this is the first way that we're going to start to produce different effects that will increase our blood pressure. But we also have antidiuretic hormone whose release is going to be stimulated as well due to these baroreceptors. More antidiuretic hormone is going to prevent the process of diuresis. Diuresis is urine formation, so therefore we prevent urine secretion and we keep that liquid in the bloodstream. So that's going to go over the kidneys to conserve salt, which therefore pulls more water over by osmosis and gives us an increase in blood volume. Now, we also will see that ADH is a vasoconstrictor, and that comes from its other name, vasopressin. That's how we can remember that ADH is also going to lead to a vasoconstriction. So it is both antidiuretic hormone and the vasomotor center that will play into vasoconstriction. Now that's the first set of pathways that we see, but we also will see that the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system will play a major role too. The baroreceptors in the kidneys are also going to be sensing blood pressure, and when blood pressure drops going through the kidneys, that's going to stimulate our juxtaglomerular cells to release renin. Renin is going to interact with angiotensinogen from the liver to create angiotensin 1, and then ACE from the lungs is going to turn angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And we've already spoken about angiotensin's major actions also. Angiotensin 2's two major roles are releasing aldosterone from the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone is going to affect the kidneys to conserve more water, and that will increase blood volume. And angiotensin 2 will be a third vasoconstrictor that we see. Any type of vasoconstriction will increase vascular resistance, and any type of water retention will increase blood volume. Lastly, any type of heart rate and contractility increase are going to increase cardiac output. So we have cardiac output, vascular resistance, and blood volume, which are our three major regulators of blood pressure. So by increasing all three of these factors, that's going to take our blood pressure back to normal, hopefully. Lastly, I just want to explain and share with you a few signs and symptoms of shock, but also explain a little bit about why these symptoms are occurring. So one of the very, very common symptoms of shock is tachycardia. There's going to be a high heart rate. And this makes a lot of sense because we're going to be going through mechanisms to ultimately increase cardiac output. Now, we will have a weak pulse. However, it is rapid. Tachycardia accounts for the rapid pulse. But since there's less blood, the pulse will be a lot weaker. Therefore, blood pressure will drastically be decreased and we'll be left with hypotension. All the while, we have angiotensin 2 and antidiuretic hormone that are preventing diuresis, and that's why we have the retention of urine and therefore will urinate less. We'll be very, very thirsty, as is an action of angiotensin 2, which will be in high concentrations during shock. And at the same time that all of this is going on, we still don't have enough cardiac output sending oxygen out to our body tissues. If the brain goes without oxygen for too long, we can have effects on our mental status. So these are just some of the signs and symptoms of shock. There are several others, but I wanted to go over those ones specifically since they directly relate to the last slide that we just covered. So taking the information that we've learned so far, we've compiled it to see how our body reacts to this particular condition. To maintain homeostasis, we will take a situation that leaves us with less blood volume and less blood pressure and go through the negative feedback loops necessary to increase blood pressure and blood volume back to normal.